make sure you're in.
Right.
Streaming live.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Sunday night Emerging Rev Board chat. Sorry for our technical difficulties today. We are historians, not computer people. It's been a crazy day here. We're really looking forward to speaking to John Adams tonight of Liberty Cigars, but he had to, and we're actually smoking his cigars right here. Mark and I are. That's why we were out here in the cold. We had this all set up to talk to John, but John had to cancel the last second. But we're going to have him back on later at a different time. So we definitely want to reach out to him and promote his cigars. If you guys like cigars and you like American Revolution, he's a great guy to talk to. Liberty Cigars is his company. And Revworth themed cigars here. I think I have the Patrick Henry and you have the
Daniel Morgan.
Yeah. Coming close to Cal Pens.
Yep, a week away from the anniversary of the Battle of Cal Pens.
There you go. So as we were watching football earlier, and Mark's team, the Bears, which is not doing so good right now, but we thought that we tried to think of an idea to do tonight that we could do pretty quickly since we had to change focus. And since we're outside in the cold and it's January, we thought we would talk about the American Revolution and winter encampments. And everyone knows about Valley Forge, and our friends in Morristown will be pounding the wall now about Valley Forge. We are going to talk about Morristown as well, but most Americans relate winter, Rev War, and Valley Forge. So we're going to talk about all different aspects of winter encampments from 1775 up through the end of the Revolutionary War. And of course, we have Billy Griffith with us, who we called maybe 15 minutes ago and said, "Billy, what are you doing?" Billy said, "I'm getting ready to watch you guys." And I was like, "No, you're actually going to be on with us." And then Phil just got done watching the Ravens win their game. So Phil's in a good mood. So basically, let's just kind of start off talking about the beginning of the American Revolution. The first winter would be, 75. Of course, we're talking about Boston and Dorchester Heights and Henry Knox. Anybody want to discuss Henry Knox?
Sure. Let's talk about the bookseller who owes on this enterprise to take the guns at Fort Ticonderoga. I think it's over some of these guns are 5,000, 6,000 pound behemoths. And he really enters into an area that he has no real expertise in. That's the thing. He's read about it. He knows how to fire them. He's been part of the a militia that trained in Boston as well with artillery, but he enters into an area to bring these guns to pretty much give George Washington that signal of victory he needs to put him up on Dorchester Heights, which will eventually force the British to evacuate. But we always give credit for Henry Knox. Obviously, he's the one that comes up with the idea. He leads it. His brother, William Knox, is part of the noble train. But one of the guys that really cements it, and he always gets, because probably of his demeanor, and he's a patrician, is Philip Schuyler. Philip Schuyler has the contacts in New York, sets him up with guys like John Becker, who is unsung hero, is actually a wagoner and is able to move freight. He does it for years. Part of the reason we know about Henry Knox's train that comes through the winter of 1775 is because of John Becker Jr., who actually leaves accounts of what it's like to pull these guns across Lake George, which I think somebody on this call knows a little bit about, across the mountains, down through New York, and then eventually into Boston without losing a single one. And there are times when the guns break through the ice. There are times when they're waiting for snow to fall and so forth. Knox thinks he can return it. He writes a letter that he can return in like 17 days. And obviously he's a little behind that schedule. But one of the other unsung heroes there is his wife, Lucy Knox. How he survives not getting divorced by her when he leaves her pregnant in a random person's house in Worcester and goes, "I'm going off into the wild. I'll see you in a little bit. Oh, by the way, you're separated from your family who are loyalists." So the victory there is both on the home front, that he's able to leave and go off into the wild of New York, which I know two guys on this call have done before in November, but not for 17 days. And they've returned. But Knox, it's truly remarkable account of traversing through, and basically they said it's something like pulling 6 tractor trailer trucks through the mountains. So to give you a visual of how hard that is on roads that are pretty much Native American paths or carved out by the first settlers, or even some left over from the French and Indian War. So it's the first single victory, and it actually boosts morale because as you go through the towns of Western Massachusetts, people come out and see what's going on, and it gets the name Noble Train. But behind William Knox or Henry Knox is William Knox, Philip Schuyler, and the Becker family, some of the unsung heroes that win that first winter of the war for the American cause.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize too. I think there's people are usually surprised, or the typical story about Washington crossing the Delaware in the winter and everything was the 18th century armies usually didn't operate that much over the winter months, mainly because of what Phil just described, how difficult it was logistically to do movements or do anything else like that for an 18th century army at the time. Yeah, no tanks, no cars, no nothing like that for moving stuff. So it's really dependent on animal and man labor to get anything done. And when there's feet of snow and ice and everything else like that, it makes it almost impossible to move around. So I think it was typical in 18th century armies, especially if you occupied a town, as the British did up in Boston, to settle down into winter quarters and expect to stay there for the few months where it was too difficult to maneuver, and then you would go out once the campaigning season resumed. And I think that's important to understand that's why, throughout 18th century armies, winter quarters was a typical thing of armies at that time.
And let's be honest, Knox's train actually waited for snow. I mean, that's the thing. They needed snow to get these sleds and everything across. Otherwise, there's no way they could move it. And there were times when they were delayed when the snow and ice started to melt. So just adding on what Mark's saying, it's amazing that even by the time of those 10 crucial days in Trenton, Princeton, which were hammered into our head last weekend, that the British Army isn't aware. I mean, the American Army does a lot more during the winter every year than any European-minded army. So you think by the second or third winter, they figure out that Washington may be up to something during a winter move. Seemed that Washington did his best work when it got cold, snowy, and the weather was deplorable.
Yeah,
Yep.
and not just Washington either, but remember that first winter of the war in 1775, Montgomery and Benedict Arnold are trying to take Quebec City, and they're kind of using the elements to their advantage there, moving under the cover of snow to assault the city, but also trying to capture Quebec before the St. Lawrence River thaws and reinforcements can be sent up to Quebec City. Obviously that fails though, and while there's the winter encampment around Boston, 1775-76, you also have a winter encampment up in Quebec, or outside the walls of Quebec still, after that failure.
And that battle was fought in the middle of like a blizzard, right? I think it's just amazing that they were even able to, especially the technology at the time, flintlock muskets and things like that, must have been so difficult to actually fire these weapons in such brutal conditions or whatever, but they did.
And that's another Daniel Morgan connection there. Daniel Morgan and Virginians are up there in that as well.
Yeah.
Famous Beeline March that our friend Travis Shaw likes so much, from the Winchester Valley area up to Boston, then up through Maine and to Canada. Those guys were pretty well traveled, considering 18th century men didn't travel that much very often, but to do it in the wintertime is pretty horrific.
Yeah.
I like to throw this out to the group as well, is that we always lament the loss of Arnold, the death of Montgomery, and that failed winter campaign into Canada. But falling back, so if you read more on this Knox Noble Train, Schuyler obviously is sick, so he returns to the Albany area, and it's Schuyler that saves Knox's bacon by getting him out of a bad contract for wagoners, for teamsters, and actually gives them supplies to secede. So it's remarkable if Schuyler's not sick, is he in Canada, and Knox can't rely on that gentleman who knows the contacts and knows the local area of Albany, and does the Noble Train get stuck in central New York, which doesn't relieve the pressure on Boston. So we always look at Schuyler, what the role of officers in combat, but sometimes the trickle-down effect of saving that first winter, losing Canada, but evicting the British from Boston. So it's a give or take. So it's just an interesting point to throw out there. I mean, obviously we like discussion and controversy at ERW, so I figured I'd throw it out there. Schuyler being 6 saved the revolution. So, but lost Montgomery.
And our good friend Vanessa had to chime in about Schuyler, her famous daughter. Right, Mark? Schuyler's famous daughter? Because you're our Hamilton.
Yeah.
Mark is our.
Well, there are 3 daughters.
I know. Mark is our Hamilton person here. Sorry. Had to go there. I apologize.
Yes.
So.
And Peggy.
And Peggy, yes. And Peggy. We're breaking out the song here soon. That will scare everybody away. So fast forwarding from 75 to 76, which we just kind of did a little bit of that. I'm going to look at Mark here.
Yeah.
About what kind of shape was, and I don't want to spend too much time about Trenton and Princeton because we just spent last weekend doing that, but it is an important time. What kind of shape is the American Army in the winter of 76 before they go over to Delaware? And then, of course, we can talk about Morristown after that.
Well, yeah, no, and everybody should definitely check out our videos from last week when we were actually up at where the Trenton and Princeton battles took place, talking about that. But really, it's right before Trenton that December 76 that the Army's really at its most dire moment. It's been decreased from the summer of 76, and honestly, it's the winter time is the best time to talk about the Revolutionary War because that's where, as we just mentioned, some of the most significant parts of the entire war happened in. We usually celebrate the revolution around July 4th. Well, July 4th, 1776, it was a good time to declare our independence, but just 6 months later, Washington's army had, almost evaporated from 25,000 men all the way down to just, about 3,000 guys left. And this small band of guys that he had with him are going to do the, remarkable crossing of the Delaware River and attack on Trenton, and then a week later, attack on Princeton. And those 2 battles, really 3 battles, if you include the battle on the creek on the 2nd of January, really changed the whole tide of the war. And Washington, immediately after his victories there, immediately scurries up to Morristown, New Jersey, where he's going to have his winter encampment for the winter, at the beginning of 1777. And the Army, after those 2 victories, there is a lot of influx of new people coming into the Army, but they're still, in a pretty dire situation. The guys, I think one of the most famous stories about guys, it's usually equated with Valley Forge, but certainly was the case in the winter of 76 and 77 was the lack of shoes, the lack of clothing, the lack of supplies, and just how many guys were dying of disease, of malnutrition, and exhaustion left and right. Not to mention all the people who were simply deserting because of those factors. So they were in pretty rough shape. But I think it's in his first winter up there, and we can bring Phil in a second to talk a little bit more about Morristown. He's probably read more about it than I have, but that first winter, one of the most important decisions Washington's going to make is to inoculate his army for smallpox. And us living, in the middle of a pandemic at the moment, I think it's especially, true that there was the invisible killer that was going around the armies at the time that, was killing more people than musket balls or bayonets, and that was disease. And one of the biggest killers was smallpox. Washington was lucky because he actually had contracted smallpox as a child, so he had already, had the antibodies or whatever to fight it off. But many of his soldiers did not. But they do determine to inoculate the Continental Army, which must have been nervous and scary for a lot of the soldiers who didn't know anything about germ theory or diseases. I mean, it's scary for us because we're still learning about this current disease or virus, COVID-19, but they had no idea of what they were up against. But they make this decision to inoculate, and it turns out that may have been one of the most important decisions Washington made during the entire war, because it is going to preserve many of his soldiers that are going to be able to hang on through the winter of 1777 at that first encampment at Morristown. So I'll let Phil talk a little bit more about Morristown, that first encampment. But I do want to also mention these encampments, they're not static, groups sitting around. There's still soldiers out patrolling, doing reconnaissance, raiding, gathering supplies. So although they are called winter quarters, there's a lot more activity going on than just kind of hunkering down and waiting for winter to pass. But I'll pass it off to Phil to talk about that first encampment at Morristown.
Certainly. So yeah, Washington tends to head to Morristown. It becomes the place where he spends most, where he slept the most, I guess, during the Revolution, probably in one area. What's neat about the town of Morristown, obviously, you have the National Historical Park that covers the encampments. It has the Ford Mansion where he spends the winter of 79-80. But even the town of Morristown, when you go down, there are plaques around the town talking about the other winter encampment, including where Washington spends that first winter. It's at a place called Arnold's Tavern. No relation to the Benedict Arnold, but it's right on the green downtown as well. The Army is so depleted because of what went on in the campaigning season, because of the expirement of enlistments, that a lot of them actually stay in the town, which is remarkable. And as they're inoculated, as Mark was saying, I think less than 2% of the soldiers who went to the inoculation actually died from it. So we always think about how risky it was when you're inserting a medium or a pus into someone's arm to try to have them inflicted. What makes Morristown an amazing place as well is that it's behind the Watchung Mountains there, so he does have a little bit of cover. It's on that it's on thoroughfares that are moving north and south. But the town itself, I mean, when the Army gets there, they do take over the majority of the town there in 1776, 1777. The town had been there since 1730s. It has still today, and if you walk around, some amazing history, but it is a place where Washington's Army is able to recoup and get to for a period of safety, because they're able to use their mountain passes that kind of keep an eye on the British, who really don't, and it implements the first of the two winters. So Morristown, obviously a national park, but if you go downtown, there are plaques around the churches where they put some of the soldiers, and it's amazing too, there was any wood left after a one encampment, they come back 2 years later. But so that's the one. The first Morristown winter encampment, 1776, 1777.
So Phil, what made the winter encampments? You can kind of lump them together if you want. What made the winter encampments at Morristown, so hard, right? Other than cold and snow, what other problems are going on in Morristown that are making it such a bad situation for the Americans, to the point where you have, mutinies, and you have, soldiers, threatening to quit? So what's going on in Morristown? Because we know about Valley Forge, and we'll get to Valley Forge, but I want to give Morristown to do. What makes Morristown so bad?
Well, I mean, it's a colder winter. I mean, the 79-80, I forget how many documented snowstorms they had, but there's a nice exhibit in the national park there. It's something like over 90 recorded snowstorms or something like that. I mean, it just pounds on them of the winter. One of the best accounts is actually the historian there, Eric Olson, who once said the reason that Morristown is not well known as compared to Valley Forge in 1779, 1780 is because they're too successful. No one dies. They have less than 200 soldiers die in that winter encampment. Part of that is because they learned the lesson of what happened the year before. And so we like to hear stories of overcoming misery. We like the accounts that come out of Valley Forge. But Morristown, they're at that point, they're a little more experienced on how to construct the huts and so forth. I know we have sorry, I was corrected. Great listener, John Hazels, just said over 20 snowstorms. He's one of the rangers up there as well. One of the great park friends up there, Steve, has done some archaeology as well with Monmouth University and so forth, and then looking how they uncovered the rows of huts, how that made differences, or where they put them on some of the ridges. But it comes down to, I mean, if you're not paid, you're going to be upset. But also, too, is that some of these soldiers who had signed up for 3 years or so forth are getting enlistments are seeing these other guys coming and getting enlistments of pretty much a year's pay right up front, or they're getting other promises. So some of these Pennsylvania line and so forth are upset because they want to actually get their enlistments over and then re-up with these new terms and so forth. And so that's part of actually the compromise that is done by Wayne and other ones when the Pennsylvania line marches out. I think to get all the way to Princeton, on the way to Philadelphia or Trenton to meet the Continental Congress for their grievances. But it is, yeah, by that time, the bounties have gone up, the promises have gone up. I mean, it's so much that one town in Massachusetts is offering even cattle. So you get land, cattle, and everything else to entice soldiers. And so some of these soldiers who signed up early in the war for 3 years or duration are a little frustrated because of what they received compared to what these new guys are coming in. So they want to get out of their enlistments that are, some of them are expiring already 3 years in, 1779, if they joined in 1776. They want to get out of it so they can get some of these inducements to return. So unfortunately, I think it's the New Jersey line later that has more severe repercussions because Washington thinks what Wayne and all them did with the Pennsylvanians are a little too light. So lack of pay, too successful in their lodging, and not enough deaths, according to Eric Olson, to make Morristown not as well known as Valley Forge.
Well, we kind of jumped from where we're talking about both Morristowns, but I think we should talk about the most famous one, the Valley Forge.
Bill, you want to jump in as a New Jersey guy? I mean, Phil's writing a book about Valley Forge, but you know,
I've written a book. Written. It's done. It's out of my hands.
Coming out soon, knock on wood. Hopefully COVID lets publishers start printing it soon. But let's let Billy talk. He's Jersey. He owns it better than Phil does, just because he's from there, Phil.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, with Valley Forge, the middle of December is when Washington's army finally goes into encampment there. It's about 18 miles up the Schuylkill River from Philadelphia, which the British had just occupied in September. And we were talking about the deaths. I think it's like 1 out of every 4 men who is in camp there at Valley Forge ends up dying. So that's roughly, I think, like over 2,000 who will die. And most of it is either from smallpox, and there's also a huge typhus outbreak too. And many of the men are going to be taken out of the actual encampment and put into like kind of general hospitals throughout the surrounding area to try to combat that. But this is so early in the war still that there really isn't any kind of set, what's the right word, like protocol or anything when it comes to setting up these encampments. I mean, men are literally digging latrines right next to where they're sleeping in these huts that are housing about 12 men. And at the time, most of the men are just living on what were known as fire cakes, which is like dough and water, essentially like hardtack. And there's some occasions where the logistical system in the Continental Army is just in such, it's just been, falling apart over the previous year that there's some occasions where the men are going like 6 days straight without any meat, or some days without any provisions at all. I mean, it's a very dire circumstance, and that was such a dark year. But also a bright year for the Continentals in 1777. Now, they do lose Philadelphia, but you also have the victory at Saratoga, which eventually will lead to France joining the Americans and supporting them militarily by sending troops here. So there's a lot of promise that comes out of that winter at Valley Forge. We talk about American resiliency, but we always think of Valley Forge usually in an ability to overcome these great sufferings. Because when Baron von Steuben, freshly arrived from Europe, arrives there in February, he's going to turn things around. He's going to make it, teach the Continentals, how to create an orderly military camp where, they dig their latrines further away from their huts so they aren't sleeping next to where they're defecating. But he's also going to begin to drill them, and there's going to be a uniform training system now. So this is, we'll really see, it's the birth of the American Army, you can say, as a professional force. So when they do finally march out of Valley Forge in June 1778 to move across New Jersey, they've undergone a tremendous transformation. So there's a lot of things that we remember Valley Forge for: the suffering there, and as I mentioned, the birth of the real American Army.
So let's talk about Baron von Steuben that you brought up. I don't know if Phil, it could be either you or Billy or even Mark, really, but there's statues to him everywhere, which is not just there at Valley Forge, but also at Monmouth. So what did he do, and is it is his impact been overplayed throughout time, or is he really that important to the American cause? I think he is, but I'll let you, one of you two, or even Mark, talk about like what does he exactly do, and then is he given proper credit? I most of my reading on him is his Virginia campaign, where he doesn't do that great of a job here in Virginia in 1780-81. But obviously, he's most known for Valley Forge. So, if you guys talk about what he did, and is it deserving of all the credit and praise that he gets today?
I'll take a first stab at this. What I feel like the successful European officers that come to the American Revolution is the ones that are adaptable and flexible. Lafayette understands his role, and so without wanting a big command, wanting pay or so forth, serving for free, and which wins the hearts. Von Steuben realizes that when he gets there, that you cannot train the American volunteer the same way that European soldiers are trained, and that's an amazing concession if you think about it, because yes, he might not have as much experience as he said he did with the Prussian army, but he's been around militaries in the German states for a long while. And so he adapts with the help of course, some translators into doing small company, like model companies that then can train the larger and so forth. And he understands that he's doing something new. He understands the psyche of the Americans. He even adds a little comedy to it by telling his aide to cuss at the soldiers at certain times in English because he can't do it. The first words he learns is, I think, curse words as well. But one of the things is the flexibility to teach these soldiers how to be soldiers, how to march, how to go from column to line, how to do their paces and so forth. And what's amazing too is the fields, as it draws the attention of other soldiers while they're watching these model soldiers companies going on. And so it kind of builds this spirit de corps as it goes on. And I mean, you sometimes you can practice, as they say, practice everything all day on the practice field. And then when it comes to game time, it doesn't translate. Well, it quickly translates into places like Barron Hill and Monmouth as well, that these soldiers did learn and it sunk in quickly and so forth. And that's one of the, testaments too, is that Washington's army comes out of Valley Forge with not only Baron von Steuben leading him that way, but also with a guy on a quartermaster that is ready to supply the army moving forward as well. And so the two things, train them like an army and feed them like an army, both kind of tend to happen after that. So I think von Steuben's adaptability and flexibility is what makes him one of the top European officers to come, especially at that time at the Valley Forge encampment.
And we mentioned Baron von Steuben, transforming the American army, at least as like a fighting force, but talked about feeding an army too. I mentioned that the logistical system for the Americans was in shambles. Thomas Mifflin, who was serving as a quartermaster general, literally just resigned before the army goes into encampment at Valley Forge. And it's a very dark time because it's very difficult for the Americans to gather supplies too, because the Continental Congress had gone bankrupt by this time. So British gold is obviously worth more than American currency. So even patriot civilians or citizens are preferring to sell their goods to the British army rather than the Americans. But then Nathaniel Greene is appointed quartermaster general, and you also have Jeremiah Wadsworth as commissary general, and together those two men filled the supply stores and everything with food. So by the time the spring comes around, there's literally a surplus of food and other supplies for the Continental Army.
Can I throw one other thing in about von Steuben as well? And I'll preface this by I'm going to be classified as a homer here, but you think about one of the two greatest lines in the Revolution Army of 1777 going in 78 are the Delaware Blues and the Maryland line. So there's the ones that, from Hazlitt, the Times of Trenton up to January 3rd, the ones that follow the reconstituted Delaware line. Those 1,200 soldiers are in Wilmington. So Washington has detailed some of his best infantry away from the Valley Forge encampment to Wilmington to protect the storehouses and the forage areas of Delaware, of northern Maryland, around the head of Elk, where Hal did land. So von Steuben is training soldiers, and these are not the ones that are considered the dependable ones. these are the ones, I mean, Washington will send south. So von Steuben's training other infantry. So it is a testament to him resonating down through all the ranks, all the different lines, all the different soldiers. With Washington being without 1,200 of his best soldiers at the Valley Forge encampment because they're in Wilmington during the winter. So just throwing it out there. Preface this
I think Valley Forge is ultimately like one of the reasons why it's seared in American memory. Really, is a couple reasons. One, you guys mentioned, is the great amount of privation the common soldiers suffered there. But then ultimately, what a successful story it ends up being, because the army that marches out of Valley Forge is going to end up performing ably in the, especially at Monmouth. And Billy just wrote a book about Monmouth or whatever, and how the American army served so well there. And so this winter beforehand kind of serves as this really encapsulating story of the American army going through this great suffering and then coming out the other end a greater fighting force. And I think Baron von Steuben plays an important role in that. That's why he's been chosen often as emblematic of that transition of the American army during that awful winter. And then, I think of the privation of the Continental Army shouldn't be understated either. Stories about men walking through the snow that you could actually, follow the trace of the army through the blood in the snow from their shoes were all cracked and open. Those are true stories. And this is actual privation these guys suffered. And unlike, a lot of, the Minutemen or the militias who would just go home after a crisis, these Continentals, they stuck it out throughout that entire winter. And that was so important because as long as Washington and his Continentals existed and were a force to be reckoned with, the rebellion or the American Revolution stayed alive. So very important during these winter months to try to keep everything together. And Washington's going to play obviously an enormous role in that as well.
I think one of the best paintings that gets underrepresented in the war is William Trago's The March to Valley Forge. If you look at that one, he really encapsulates what it's like for the soldiery if you look closer. So I know it's not one of them. I guess it's well known, but it's not one of the ones that immediately comes to mind. But if you take a look at the painting in a little more detail, you see that he's painted in soldiers marching barefooted, in rags, and so forth, and in the different type of uniforms. So I think it's for the time period a very accurate, even though it's not focused on something specifically, an accurate depiction of the army.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty accurate. But the more famous image from that winter, of course, is Washington kneeling in the snow in prayer at Valley Forge, which last month we had Dr. Peter Henriquez on, and in his book about Washington, writes about how that was really kind of a post-war myth that kind of came out. But regardless of its, whether it happened or not, it really does sum up that, the trying time. It's just like kind of what I was talking about Washington crossing the Delaware painting, even though it's not historically accurate, and a lot of these representations of the war aren't. It gets across really the purpose of the story, or kind of the meat of the story. And in Washington praying at Valley Forge really shows you how desperate a moment it was for the American cause, which it really was in a tight spot. And even though it's, can be considered historically accurate, I think it does sum up the trying time and how few options the Americans had at that moment.
So Mark brought up militia. So is there any circumstances, and when we talk about winter encampments, we mostly mean Continental Army for the most part. Mark brought up a good point. Militia is usually heading back. Is there any example, I'm sure Mark's going to jump in here, but Trenton and Princeton, any example of a winter campaign that relied heavily on militia? Since militia really, we don't think about militia in these winter encampments, but how often is militia being used in the winter during the war, other than Trenton and Princeton?
Oh, yeah, and like I said, I'll just jump in real quick and say, because there are going to be militia that are going to be play an important role in the Trenton and Princeton campaign. Even though the main first battle of Trenton's going to rely heavily on the regulars, the second and third battles have a large percentage of militia soldiers that are going to fight. And then also both in the weeks leading up to the battles at Trenton and Princeton, and then also the weeks after, New Jersey militias, across the state are going to be attacking different British outposts and different supply lines and things like that. And their activity is going to basically coincide and help the main Continental Army. And so they kind of have a symbiotic relationship where one kind of needs the other. You need the actual army in the field to help, gin up morale boosts for the locals to come out and fight, and vice versa. The locals coming out and fighting are going to tie up a lot of the British main lines to make it easier for the main Continental Army to engage. So they kind of have at least in that campaign. Now, the other campaigns, I don't know if militias played as large a role, but definitely in Trent and Princeton, they're going to play an important role.
I mean, if Valley Forge winter, I mean, the militia, there is that area between the British outpost in Philadelphia and where they're coming out the Forge and Valley Forge. There are militia from New Jersey, Pennsylvania that are harassing patrols, harassing foraging parties, keeping an eye on what's going on. Even the date of Mischianza or whatever you pronounce it, when Hal's supposed to leave, there are some shots fired on the redoubt as well. So there are militia harassing the British as best they can during that winter of Valley Forge. We do have a comment I see from Jason Wickersteed about the Forge Wars, obviously, but I mean, don't get enough credit, but most of the winners in the Southern Theater, it's the militia that are keeping things going. Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, other ones of that nature. There's not a big continental force in the Carolinas, so they don't get written about because they're small little engagements. But and I don't want to tarry too far into this because Mark will bring up the Patriot. But I mean, there are militia working in the winters. And so, yeah, in the Southern theaters, but in the North, it is happening during Valley Forge, keeping an eye on what is going on around Philadelphia and providing information when they can to Washington and so forth.
So talking about logistics, really quick, Phil or Billy or even Mark. So I think Billy alluded to the logistics issues at Valley Forge.
Yeah.
And so I know that kind of plays into some of the bigger names that come on later on that are trusted Washington guys like Greene and such. So how much of a difference do these guys who kind of take over logistics at Valley Forge make a difference?
I mean, for months, there's no, as Billy alluded to, I mean, Mifflin just goes home, just goes back to his state. And I think it's not until February that Greene even Congress gets around to appointing a successor. So, I mean, you're looking at 2-3 months of no one's in command. And then you have commissary, quartermaster, you have ordnance, so you have, like anything else, bureaucracy going on. And so it's streamlining those things and creating the depots. And also, I mean, Greene doesn't get enough credit. What he says, he's never heard of a quartermaster that goes down in history. But setting up, also knowing Washington and setting up, okay, where would the Army possibly advance so I can send these storage depots get out on the route, which is forward thinking as well. Valley Forge is a training ground for Nathaniel Greene to go south when he goes in 1781 and figures out, or 1780, 1781, maps of the area, rivers, where the boats are, where the mills are, the whole retreat to the Dan is because probably what he learned on the fly as quartermaster. But yeah, I mean, just to have a quartermaster or not have an active quartermaster for 2-3 months during the winter encampment, it almost seems cruel, and because the ones that are going to suffer are the soldiers that are now eating whatever they can get their hands on or going without. So, I mean, that's one of the things that flies under the radar at Valley Forge is Mifflin goes home, Congress dallies about trying to find a replacement, and you have months of inaction that costs us probably a lot of soldiers' lives and a lot of health issues as well.
So I was just going to bring up another winner.
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk about
towards the end of the war.
I'm talking about probably one of the more important winners, which is not, people don't realize, what happens in Newburgh and in New Windsor, the encampments up there after Yorktown. Of course, everyone thinks the war's over at Yorktown. Everyone goes home and yay, we're free. But actually the war continues on, obviously, with large camps. So who wants to talk about Newburgh? Conspiracy. I think Mark will probably talk about George putting that down, but we're talking March of and it's still winter time. It's getting into spring, but there's a large winter encampment. We were up there 2 years ago. Was it 2 years ago now? I think it was 2 years ago. We were up there for one of our trips up there. Great campsite. If you ever get a chance to go to New Windsor, it's excellent. There's a great historic site there. Newburgh has a great historic site. We're going to talk about historic sites and books here after this, but let's talk about the Newburgh conspiracies and what happened there, Mark.
Yeah, no. So, well, I mean, there was a couple encampments, yeah, because the Newburgh conspiracy that Rob's alluding to happens actually. It's in the winter of 1783. So this is right near the very end of the war. So as Rob mentioned, everybody usually tends to think that 1781 is the end of the war, but there are 2 more years of warfare going on while the Treaty of Paris was being worked out overseas. And during that time period, Washington had to try and keep, again, this army together in order to maintain our independence, because otherwise, the whole thing could have been sunk during that time period. So it's important that they keep these armies together. And I say armies too, because there's also encampments down like in South Carolina. Nathaniel Greene's trying to keep his army together down outside of Charleston, because even though we had won at Yorktown, there were still large British armies in Charleston and New York City and in other places. And Washington's outside of New York City, up in Newburgh, and among his officers, there's growing discontent, similar to as Phil was mentioning at Morristown in 1780, with some of the soldiers getting upset about not being paid. There's still this large discontent among many of the soldiers and even in the officers of Washington's army. And there's even talk among some of the officers of potentially trying to overthrow the government down in Philadelphia and set up a military coup. General Horatio Gates and some other officers, we believe were involved in some of this. And there was a letter that was circulated among the officers to meet at this, they called it the temple up there outside Newburgh, which we'll talk about when we mention historic sites, because there's the site there is preserved and there's a recreation of this building. But the officers meet there and Washington shows up to meet with them. And Washington is very much against this idea. He wants to maintain the army until we get our independence and turn everything back over to the civilian Congress. He has a letter from a congressman that he wants to read to the officers to show that, they were on their side and everything's going to be okay. But, Washington goes up in front of this group of officers and he breaks out this letter and he's trying to read it. And he pulls out some spectacles to put on his eyes. And none of the soldiers at this, or any of the officers at that moment, had seen him wear spectacles before. And then he says, if you'll permit me, not only has my hair turned gray, but I've gone nearly blind in the service to my country. And of course, he says that and puts on his spectacles and reads a letter. But at that moment, after he said that, most of the men break down weeping. And at that moment, all talk of, overthrowing the civilian government kind of is silenced. And of course, just a few months later, word comes back that the war is officially over and Washington's going to resign his commission and the Continental Army is totally disbanded. And so, and that one moment at Newburgh in this winter encampment, in which, isn't remembered as a great military moment of the war, really was one of the moments that saved the American Republic. And it was all through Washington's personal character and appealing to his officers, which is a pretty amazing moment of the war.
So, talking about Newburgh, I'm looking above Billy's head. Billy has that flag on the wall to remind us that there are 2 sides to the war, which we haven't really talked about the British that much, but I guess some of us can be biased. That's why Billy's even wearing red tonight. That should be a double reminder. Look at that!
My trout.
Anyway, so let's talk about the British. So Billy, what Mark talked about, the time in Newburgh, you had the British are kind of hemmed in New York City and Charleston. So, what do you think, what would be some of the more trying stories or times that the British are suffering here in the winters in North America?
For the most part, the British Army is pretty cozy. Everyone's there. They're either in New York City or they're in Philadelphia. We mentioned the Forage War earlier. So they do struggle sometimes to actually forage and get supplies for the army, but also mentioned that Patriot sympathizers were pretty prone to selling goods to them as well, because the British could actually provide hard cash that was worth something rather than continental currency. Talking about Trenton and Princeton, after those battles, the British are essentially pushed all the way back between New Brunswick and Perth Amboy in New Jersey. They don't really have much of a foothold there, but you do have the outposts scattered throughout whatever colonies they're occupying, like in Jersey. So they're not necessarily all focused just around one major city. They do have outposts to try to spread their influence in whatever state that they're currently occupied in. But talking about Mike Trout and representing New Jersey, we didn't mention one winter encampment, and that was in Middlebrook, New Jersey. In fact, the Continental Army is there twice, in the spring of 1777 after Morristown, and then from November 1778 to June 1779. And that's nestled today in near the Watchung Mountains in Bridgewater, New Jersey. And they were essentially, Washington moved them there so they could keep a closer eye on the British in New York City before he finally in 1779 ends up moving into the Hudson Highlands, which that will essentially be the main one of the main American encampments for the rest of the war after Morristown.
And yeah, if any of you watched the show Turn, I think a lot of it takes place at that encampment. They just show, that's something else going on during a lot of these winter encampments is trying to work in intel, trying to use spies and other information to find out as much information about the enemy as far as strength and everything else like that. And just talking about British, I think one of the few winter campaigns that they engaged on, of course, was Cornwallis in the South, and around this time back in 1781. You have Cowpens, and you're going to have Guilford Courthouse, and or in between that, the races of the Dan. So although it's more rare for the actions to be happening over the winter, it definitely is happening throughout the war by both sides, for sure.
So let's talk about books, current scholarships, current books that you guys think would be good reads for people who are watching, who are interested in different actions that are taking place, whether it's an encampment or like Cowpens during the winter, during the American Revolution. So we're going to go Billy first, Phil second, Mark third, and I'll go last.
There you go.
I know. Hang on. There's a good book on Morristown. I have it over here. Let me grab it.
We'll let Phil go while Billy grabs the book. Phil.
Sure. Besides the one that's hopefully coming out in 2021 on Valley Forge,
There's nothing wrong with self-promotion. It's totally fine. We called you.
I took a page out of Mark's book. I should have shared my screen and have like a snapshot of like the cover, because then I could have been like Mark, right? Showing the cover of my book on a Zoom.
Usually Mark has the cover behind them.
Yeah.
Of course, if you're going with Cowpens, you can't go wrong with the Devil of a Whipping. That's one of the best books out there. And the Guilford follow-up or whatever, Long, Obstinate, Bloody. For Valley Forge, that if you really want to dig down deep into that whole time going up through it, Thomas McGuire's 2-volume set is great on the lead up there. I hate to go too far into like popular history, but there was one, I think Drury or Valley Forge they wrote that came out. Gives you a nice overview type thing. So before you dig in, I think it came out in late 2019. So there's books there. And then I'm struggling right now. The author's, I think it's David Head. He's author on The Crisis of Peace or something. He just came out with one on Washington. And it does detail the cantonments up at New Windsor, Newburgh, so forth. He's a professor at University of Central Florida. The book is, I think, Crisis of Peace, something like that. It just came out about a year and a half ago. Great book. Can find it in any store. The title I'll put in the comments if it comes to me, but I'll have to Google it. But those are the 4 or 5 that I would mention off the top of my head.
Right. Well, Phil went through everyone's book selection. Now we have nothing to talk about.
Let's talk about historic section.
No, just let Billy go. I do have a book that Phil didn't mention.
Yeah, I grabbed a bunch. This was put together in 2005. It's called New Jersey and the American Revolution. It's a bunch of different essays on New Jersey during the conflict. And Mark Edward Lender actually has a chapter in here on New Jersey as a military theater, and he discusses a lot about that Forge War in 1777. Some good stuff in there. And then there's this one. Phil, have you ever read this one?
Yep.
Uncertain Revolution.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
It's a good one. That's on the
It was
Morristown.
actually on my desk at Morristown
Oh,
when
really?
I got there. It was put there on the desk of the chief of interpretation to read right off the bat. So
Nice. And then I haven't read this one yet. Have you heard any good things about this on Valley Forge?
that's the one I was just mentioning. It is
Oh,
a
okay.
great overview, public history one. The authors do a great job on giving you enough information to detailed information. So I do recommend it, but it's not the one I would stop with. So continue on from there.
And then if we're talking about winter operations and the invasion of Quebec, these two,
Yes.
in my opinion, are the best ones.
Yeah.
Lefkowitz and then Desjardins, which hopefully we'll be getting up there later this year.
Border opens, we'll be there.
Just got my passport yesterday.
That's right. Get your passport, guys. We're gonna be inoculated and vaccinated heading to Quebec.
Yeah.
Mark, other
Uh,
than Pick Your Death.
yeah, nah, they already took all of them. So
I was gonna mention Drill Master of Valley Forge by Lockhart. That's a good book
Mhm.
too. More focused, not necessarily on winter in general, but von Steuben and what his important role he plays there at Valley Forge. That's definitely a great book. And as Phil did say, we gave Phil a hard time, but also Phil's book on Valley Forge should be out. It's done. It's completed. It's ready to be printed. We hope to get that out here in the spring of 2021. So historic sites, I guess we're all about public history because all of us here are public historians by trade. So Mark, favorite site, one site, not five like what Phil does, one site.
all right, I'll do the Alpha. Number one, Washington's headquarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's now the Washington Longfellow House. It's a National Park Service site. It's an excellent site. If you've never been, definitely check it out. The house itself is original to Washington's time period. Now, most of the interior, the objects and everything is interpreted to the time period of Longfellow, the famous poet from the 19th century, which is still interesting history, but it's still kind of cool to be in the rooms where Washington and his staff were that first winter, facing all of the monitoring the invasion to Quebec, waiting for Henry Knox to arrive with the cannon. It's a really kind of cool site, and the park staff up there does an excellent job of telling that story. So that'll be my contribution for a winter encampment site.
Phil, one site, Phil, not five, one.
How about one site spread out, the Knox Trail? We'll do that. You can follow some of the markers through New York of Henry Knox and the Noble Train going through. So that way, it's one site spread out, so I cover both and both topics there.
Your Morristown fan club is going to be very upset.
I wanted to give Morristown to the New Jerseyite. I wanted to give them Morristown to the native New Jerseyite here, or New Jerseyan. So I didn't want to step on his toes like I stepped on everyone's book's toes. So I didn't want to do it twice in one night.
I was actually going to say for mine, some of the sites associated with the Middlebrook encampment. I just went there for the first time, like right before the pandemic began. And there's the main site associated with that encampment area. It's just a tiny little like open park off of Middlebrook Road in Bridgewater, New Jersey. But they have some interpretation there saying that it's quite possible that encampment is where the Betsy Ross flag flew for the first time over a Continental Army encampment. And a lot of the houses, too, that were used as headquarters by like Henry Knox, George Washington, in Somerville, New Jersey, and then Nathaniel Greene, too. They're all still preserved and standing today, so you can go and see, and von Steuben, too. So you can go and visit all these headquarters sites that the top brass of the American Army were quartered up in throughout those encampments.
Yeah, that's a neat site. We had an ERW trip up there about 4 years ago with Bert Dunkley, Doug Crenshaw, and Mark Wilcox, and we went up through there, and it's a great little spot. They got an American flag flying on the flagpole and interp sign. You really have to look for it, but it's a cool site. So that is a neat spot. I'm going to go with Vanessa. I'm going to say Cowpens. Even though it's not a winter encampment, we're right in line with the anniversary coming up. The Cowpens battlefield is excellent. If you ever get a chance to get down there, definitely see it. Great visitor center, great museum, but done some great archaeology to identify where the different lines were there that Morgan's going to set up. And they do a great job interpreting the landscape. It's pretty well preserved. So I'm going to say Cowpens. So I'm the one, I picked the one national park, right?
No, mine's National Park too.
Okay.
The Cambridge
yes.
House, Longfellow House is National Park Service site. What I'm surprised is nobody chose either Valley Forge or Morristown, which I would argue are the two major encampments.
We want to get people, we know people watching know Valley Forge, you know Morristown.
Yeah.
But the site that Billy mentioned, I bet very few people know
True.
outside Jersey. So that's a good site. So
very true. Lots of stuff to explore.
Lots of stuff to explore safely and smartly right now. But I want to thank Billy and Phil for coming in at the last second. Not that you guys had nothing else better to do tonight, but I knew you'd be available.
Always on call.
We thought it'd be better to have more people than just Mark and I talking back and forth over this campfire. But thank you guys for joining us. For those watching, don't forget, check out the blog. We have launched tickets for our Victory or Death bus tour of Trenton and Princeton this November 12th through 14th. We did a trip up there last week. We guided it out. We tested it out. We have plans in place and we're ready to go for that. We hope by then we'll be able to travel much more freely. So we're going to move forward with that. So definitely go to our blog and check that out. There's also information on a Facebook page and we have lots of posts scheduled for coming up. And don't forget also for those who live in the Washington, D.C. area or even the Mid-Atlantic, we have our symposium coming up in May with the with the Office of Historic Alexandria in downtown Alexandria. A symposium that will involve Mark Malloy speaking about drunk Hessians, quote unquote drunk Hessians. Vanessa will be speaking. Our good friend Travis Shaw will be speaking about Loyalists. Michael Harris is going to be talking about Brandywine. And then John Reese will be talking about African American Continentals and the American Revolution. So some great topics. Check out information on the symposium on our website and on the Facebook page, of course, also the bus tour. So thank you all for tuning in with us tonight, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, we'll be back here. We have a topic in mind. We're not going to release it yet because we're still doing some research on it, but we'll have a great topic here in 2 weeks. Thanks again for joining us, and take care. I have Mark log us off. He's closer.